Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Shamil Chandaria. Shamil is an expert in the fields of artificial intelligence and computational neuroscience, as well as an entrepreneur, philanthropist, meditator, and also a good friend. He was a founder of the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, the world's first ever psychedelic research centre. He provides funding for the Global Priorities Institute at Oxford University, as well as for research into the neuroscience of meditation at Harvard and UC Berkeley. In 2022, he was awarded an OBE in the UK for his services to science and technology, finance, and philanthropy. Today, we talk about one of the topics he's most passionate about, which are the connections between awakening and our contemporary model of the brain as a prediction machine. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So yeah, I'm glad we finally are making this happen. I feel like it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, it's well over a year, right?
Yeah. And I'll direct the audience to the talk you recently gave in Oxford on meditation and the Bayesian brain. Although I liked what you said when we spoke about it, that it's kind of the times we had to use code for awakening to not kind of scare off the scientists, I guess, right?
Yeah. The subtitle is a predictive processing account of radical changes to phenomenal experience. And that's really code for awakening, liberation, enlightenment.
Right. Maybe since, we're very much on the same page with a lot of this stuff, so I guess I'm going to be sensitive to bringing the audience along, although people who have been listening to my podcast for a while will probably be on a similar page as well. But maybe you could share a bit about your kind of background as a meditator and kind of academic background, so people have a sense of where you're coming from, because we're going to be talking about this kind of synthesis of science and spirituality, right? And you're particularly well trained, I would say, in both those areas.
Yeah. So, on the meditation side, I've been meditating for, I guess now 35 years. And it's been a really interesting journey. I guess maybe over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been working on the jhana practice, and then more recently, in the last couple of years, non-dual practice. So I've been exposed to kind of early Buddhism. Very early on, I was doing mantra meditation, which is more Advaita Vedanta, and now more Tibetan Buddhism, kind of non-dual practice. So I suppose I have a broad overview of the meditation landscape. Maybe not so much in Zen, but apart from that, I think I've had some experience of the areas. And in terms of my intellectual academic background, I started off in kind of natural sciences and then did mathematical stuff. I also have my PhD was kind of almost like applied maths, but even though it was formally mathematical economics. And I have a postgraduate degree in philosophy. And then after spending time in industry and finance, I kind of really moved over to philosophy, neuroscience, which is, really where my interests were. And I spent 6 years at DeepMind, on AI. And that was really, I think, very important to kind of really understand how neural networks work, reinforcement learning, and ultimately where my real interest is like the relationship with the algorithms that are going on in artificial intelligence turn out to be very helpful to understand the algorithms that might be going on in the brain. And so computational neuroscience has been very important for me. I was a research fellow at the Institute of Philosophy in London University School of Advanced Study, and there, kind of maybe about 2014, because I was the mathematical guy, they said, well, can you make sense of this free energy principle stuff? All this entropy stuff, we don't get it. So I really did a deep dive at that time and gave a tutorial on it. And over the years, I've come to think that the kind of free energy principle is, a leading contender for a general theory of how the brain might be working at an algorithmic level. So that's some of my background.
Yeah, that's great. Is the free energy principle tutorial available online anywhere?
No, but in fact, recently I've been thinking that actually I want to do a series called Everything You Were Too Afraid to Ask About Free Energy. What was it? Everything You Wanted to Know About Free Energy, Too Afraid to Ask.
Right. Yeah.
An allusion to the Woody Allen movie.
Right.
And because actually you do need quite a broad background to come at this, because the free energy principle as it comes into us from Carl Friston is kind of, it's an information theoretic term to do with the variational algorithm for approximate Bayesian inference. But, you know, it seems to be connected to the second law of thermodynamics somehow. That's odd because they're very different concepts. One is thermodynamics and one is information theory. And then on top of that, there is this relationship between information theory and thermodynamics, which we need to make sense of. And in fact, if, you know, perhaps they're just an isomorphism, they just share the same mathematical structure. But it turns out to be even more complicated than that, because it turns out that if you have information about a system, you can actually extract useful work. You can create free energy. That's not breaking the law of conservation of energy. It's creating useful energy in terms of non-entropic energy. So it's quite a layered discussion, and you kind of need a background to fully understand the whole stack. You need a background in statistical mechanics and information theory and kind of machine learning. So I want to do a 3 or 4 part tutorial series. Actually, I'll put it out there.
Yeah, I'd love to see that, because free energy principle is famously kind of hard to understand even for experts, and you're a great communicator of this stuff. So feel free in this conversation to touch on some of that stuff. But I think you're right that it kind of deserves a multi-part deep dive. Yeah. So you mentioned briefly the Janus, which is something that I've not really spoken about on my podcast. I've tried playing around in the first jhana, but I've always been on the kind of non-dual approach. But I wonder if that might be a good place to kind of just explain to people what that is, so then we can get a landscape of kind of the terrain of different meditative states and the kind of things we're trying to account for with the Bayesian brain approach.
Yeah, sure. Well, the jhanas are they're kind of advanced meditation states, either states of concentration, shamatha, they're considered, or I would say that they are states of unfabrication, and essentially, just to kind of paint a picture of what they look like. You have to have a certain amount of concentration to really get into the first jhana. And that's sometimes called access concentration. And then after that, there are a series of actually 8 stages of these jhanas. The first one is when the normal sense of the body starts to become unfabricated. Now, maybe should I touch a little bit on what we have unfabricated, because this is very important. This is really where, when we get into the predictive processing framework, this will really come out. But essentially, coming from the predictive coding framework, we see that our concepts and all the phenomena that arise are in fact constructions. We go around the world and are not apprehending the world directly. When we look out at the tree, we're not seeing the trees directly through windows in our soul. We're getting sensory data, and that sensory data is very ambiguous, very difficult to decipher, actually. And the brain has to make sense of this rough and ready sensory data that we get, and figure out the causes of our sensations. In other words, what's really going on, what's out there. And that's not just like looking out the window. That turns out you have to do Bayesian inference. Bayesian inference is the mathematical procedure to optimally figure out what a good representation of your causes are. But that turns out to be computationally explosive. It would require infinite computational resources to actually do real Bayesian inference, because we would have to go through every single hypothesis of what's out there in the world, and then simulate all of that, and that's just too big. So what the brain does, and actually what we do in machine learning and in artificial intelligence, is do a workaround. And that workaround is called approximate Bayesian inference. And it's basically saying, look, what we'll do is we'll take a guess at what's going on from, based off our prior experiences and the sensory data coming in. And we'll simulate what's going on. We'll have a kind of virtual reality representation of what's going on, what the world model is. And then we'll compare the output of that virtual simulation, that world model that we created, and we'll compare that to the sensory data that we do have, the rough and ready sensory data. And that will set up a prediction error. That will set up some sort of discrepancy prediction error. And then we change the dials and knobs and parameters of our simulation, what's called the generative model, so that we minimize the prediction error. And that way, as Anil Seth and Chris Frith have put it, we live in a controlled hallucination. It's controlled because it's a hallucination which is, in some sense, as close as possible to the sensory data, in the sense that its output is similar to the sensory data we get. So we are living in our world model. Now, this world model is constructed in a kind of hierarchical way, and we construct it stage by stage. For example, visual perception, we might construct it with edges and corners, and then small figures, and then noses and eyes and mouth, and eventually faces, and then finally higher order concepts like truth and beauty. So we construct this, our world in this kind of hierarchical way. And at the bottom of the hierarchy are kind of raw sensations. And at the top of the hierarchy are things like language, concepts, planning, reasoning. And these constructions, we can now see how they work, because we can actually see in artificial neural networks precisely how these features can be extracted. So when we get artificial neural networks to kind of train on visual data, say faces or objects, they deconstruct those images. They first extract the low-level features, then mid-level features, and then the higher-level features, and then ultimately concepts. And actually, the AI systems are getting pretty good now with these language models, and we're getting towards concepts, to be honest. So the idea is that in meditation and meditation schemes like the Janus, what we are doing is we are systematically recognizing that our awareness, our experience, our phenomenal world is a kind of a construction, and we are slowly deconstructing it, seeing its constructedness, seeing how it's composed, and going down into the parts of the construction. So to come back to the jhanas, in the first, we get this access concentration simply by, for example, paying attention to breath at the nose. That tends to quieten the monkey mind, quieten the contents of experience and allows the mind to settle. And when it's settled enough, we begin to deconstruct the map of the body. I mean, the body itself has to be represented in the brain, because the brain, is just enclosed in this bony skull, and just has some nerves going in, and some time series data effectively through nervous sensations. So the brain has to kind of have this representation of the body, and what happens in the first jhana is that first level of representation of the body map starts to dissolve, and the solidity of the body starts to break down. That model becomes what in Buddhist terminology, empty. It's kind of a technical Buddhist word. It means that it lacks inherent existence. It's not really a real thing. It's kind of a construction. Okay, so the body is still there, but what you pick up is this kind of vibratory sense of sensations, sort of tingles and warmth and champagne bubbles, and it's described as energy. I mean, that's just a poetic description. What it feels like, it's essentially a description of the phenomenology of the state. And as you tune into this first jhana, it becomes quite intense. And the trick actually in this first jhana is to start tuning into the parts of it that are somehow beautiful, lovely, pleasurable. And what that tends to do is get the system locked into an absorption, a meditative absorption. So we become absorbed in a kind of physical, pleasurable sensations of the raw sensory data from our body. And that's a kind of an interesting state, because most people have never experienced that kind of pleasure of raw body sensations, sort of, the sort of utter feel, perhaps, actually it's been described as the kind of phenomenology that we might have in a massage, or maybe even sexual excitement. And that's very interesting. And that then forms this base. It's kind of quite intense. And then at some stage, you realize that within this first jhana, there is something that is even more beautiful, which is the kind of sense of pure mental well-being, a kind of a joy, not so physical, but kind of mental. And you start tuning into that. And then you transition to the second jhana, which instead of the first jhana would be physical rapture, energy. The second jhana would be pure joy. And so the energy is still there, but it's kind of in the background. And then you have this kind of physical joy, this kind of mental joy, and you tune into that. And in fMRI studies of jhana meditators, I mean, one of the things that I think we found is that the brain's reward circuitry is certainly activated, and the nucleus accumbens, the dopaminergic system, are definitely visible in the first and second jhanas. And then, so we've deconstructed this, we've gone into the kind of the sort of pure body sensations and tuned into that. And at some stage, it becomes apparent that, well, there's something even more lovely than this state. And you think, well, what could that be? This kind of joy that is independent of circumstances is the stuff of dreams, in a sense. Normally we try to make the world all exactly as we want it to get this kind of joy. But it turns out that the sort of peaceful aspect of that joy is even more lovely. And so what happens is, as we transition from the second jhana to the third jhana, is that the energy dies down and there is just the well-being component, a sort of pure contentedness component, and the peace, because now that there's no energy, there's just peacefulness in the body. And that's very interesting, because that's almost like you've had so much joy and now you're just resting in a purely contented, satiated way. And that is really, really delightful. And you can think, well, what could be better than just resting in this satiated sense? And what we realize is that at some stage you see, well, actually the peace itself is even more lovely. And you transition from this third jhana to the fourth jhana, which is just pure stillness, peace. It's officially, I think, called pure equanimity, and that is a really deep and profound state of stillness. So now we've gone beyond pleasure and joy and contentedness to find that the real thing that is underlying the state of well-being is pure peace. And then you can say, well, how much further could I fabricate? Because unfabricate. So you're deconstructing these models and you find that, well, there's actually something quite substantial to deconstruct now, which is there's still an overall sense of the body, maybe not a solid body map, but a body in which is very, very peaceful. And so there is a very big transition between the fourth jhana and the fifth jhana. In the fifth jhana, we dissolve the body map completely. So it's just pure peace, but there is no boundaries. It's called the realm of infinite space. So now we have deconstructed the body completely. And so that there are no boundaries. Now, boundlessness tends to feel in normal in sort of everyday world tends to feel sort of vast or infinite, to be as a perhaps a hyperbole, and so this kind of vast pure spaciousness comes about, and that can be a really wonderful liberation, really wonderfully liberating feeling to be, instead of being stuck in the body, now one is just vast spaciousness. And then you think, well, I don't see how you could unfabricate it any further, but one starts to notice that the space itself is a kind of a fabrication. And this is very reminiscent of the ideas of Immanuel Kant, who said, look, we use ideas like space and time and causality to construct our experience. And so we come to see that, look, this space is a construction. When we deconstruct the space itself, which sounds quite trippy, and in some sense it is, but in some sense it's very natural. we come to see that it's made of just pure consciousness. It's just pure consciousness. And so we transition from the fifth jhana to the sixth jhana, where it's just pure consciousness. And it's vast. So the realm of infinite consciousness, I think the official term is. And in this realm of infinite consciousness is extremely liberating. And you could think, well, there is, couldn't be anything more to deconstruct from here. But in fact, as we tune into the consciousness, we see that what is really at the heart of it is kind of a nothingness, a pure nothingness. And as we tune into that, it becomes everything just is this vast nothingness. And that then becomes the seventh jhana, which is the realm of infinite nothingness. Now that actually surprisingly is extremely freeing, because it's sort of one's resting in pure vast nothingness. And then of course the thought is there's nothing less than nothingness, right? But of course there's still something, which is there's a perception of nothingness. And that perception of nothingness starts to get deconstructed as we go to the eighth jhana. And the eighth jhana is called neither perception yet not non-perception. And that's a very minimal state of experience. It's difficult to describe. One way to think about it is it's like consciousness doesn't quite land, or perception doesn't fully form. And yet it's not non-perception. So this is an interesting state. And so, Rob Berbea, who was a wonderful teacher, once described it using the instructions to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy of how to fly. So if you in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the actual instruction manual on how to fly is: number 1, aim for the ground; number 2, miss. So the eighth jhana is something like a little bit like that, but that is a very, very unfabricated state. And to some extent, it might be what Thomas Metzinger has described as the minimal phenomenal experience, a state, or it might be similar to states like that, or similar to states like other maybe Vedanta, Hindu kind of states like Nirvikalpa Samadhi, where there is no no contact with the sensory gates. And so that's kind of the stack of unfabricating. Now, one wants to draw out a few dimensions. So we've been talking about this dimension of unfabricating, deconstructing our model of the world. But there is also the dimension about quietening the contents of experience, which we talked about how we get into the first jhana in the first place. So the things like the pure nothingness and the eighth jhana are very, very they're very quiet states. There isn't a lot of contents of experience, and so they're quiet in terms of calm. They are empty in terms of unfabricatedness. And then at this stage, one starts to bring in the third dimension. And in fact, this third dimension has been growing, but I've not talked about it yet. It's been growing as we go through the jhanas. And that is that we notice that our normal sense of subject-object duality is not there. that what we have done by deconstructing all this ways, we've also deconstructed our normal sense of self. And we become aware of the substrate of the generative model itself, the substrate of our phenomenal experience itself. And that is some sort of, that's been described as pure awareness or pure consciousness or Rigpa or Brahman, or, you know, different words for this, the Buddha nature. And this pure awareness is then recognized. And in fact, of course, initially it's recognized in this very quiet way. So it's just pure awareness with no contents. But later on, we can recognize that, look, all the experiences, all the phenomenology that you know, the experience of this bottle and experience of these glasses are also made of that same awareness. And so it's kind of seen as there is this backdrop of pure awareness, but also that all phenomena are made of this pure awareness. And that's essentially the sort of recognition of non-dual awareness. And the typical analogies that are used are something like a mirror and the reflections in the mirror. And the mirror is this pure non-dual awareness, and the reflections are also the contents of the awareness, but they're nothing, in a sense, but they're nothing but the mirror, or a film screen with a movie projecting on it, or just a TV screen. And of course, you can get lost in the characters, and, you know, someone's shooting someone else, and you're trying to escape from a baddie, and you know, you're lost in the story. But then you kind of realize, it's all just the screen, and this is just a movie going on the screen. So that's the kind of idea of recognizing the constructed nature of our reality through the jhanas.
Right. And then to kind of touch on the metaphysics here, because I think you mentioned this ties in nicely with kind of Kant's view. So with Kant, you have, well, first, if you start with this kind of naive realism view that you spoke about, of feeling like you're looking out at the world that is kind of pre-given, you're looking at it through transparent lenses. And when I see a weed in the garden, it's just a weed, and I'm seeing it. But then the insight that Kant offers is all of that, what you perceive as your world, is happening in consciousness. It's phenomenal. It's the phenomenal world. There is a world out there. There is some quantum buzz that makes up the weed, but your perception of it as a weed is something that's in your consciousness. And I use that example because, you know, we're talking about emptiness, and I think you can use that. You know, most people, I think, can have the sense that if they perceive a plant to be a weed, and then they're told, well, actually, in a different culture, they don't call it a weed because it doesn't grow virulently, and they don't try and get rid of it. So actually, you can see quite easily, okay, weed isn't inherent to that plant. It's a concept I have in my mind. You know, like actually on where I'm living, there's some beautiful cistus flowers, and early on when I was here, someone told me, like, I said how beautiful they were, and someone said, oh yeah, that's a weed. And in my head there was a kind of, it is a weed, it's virulent, we need to try and get rid of it. But it was an interesting moment for me because I'd just been appreciating it as a beautiful flower. I hadn't been thinking of it as a weed. So that's the kind of emptiness thing, that the idea of weed is actually, the thing itself is empty of that concept. There is no essence of weed inside it. It's a relational thing that you're kind of projecting. And then also deeper than that, if you look at the plant itself, there is no essence of plant. It wouldn't be what it is without the sun and without the kind of history of the unfolding of the universe. So nothing has an essence, right? That's the kind of the emptiness thing. But to focus on the kind of metaphysics of Kant, so you have this when we're talking about everything that arises, all phenomena being in consciousness, we're talking about this kind of simulation of the world that we're going around the actual physical world in. So I think there's a important distinction to be made here, because I think as people have the kind of insight of non-dual awareness and say, okay, everything in my world is made of consciousness, I think there can be a kind of slippery thing happening where the feeling that my experience of the world is how the world actually is, that's seen through on one level, but actually that assumption's still there. So it's like, well, if all of this is arising in consciousness, maybe consciousness is what everything arises in. And I personally don't think that's kind of valid leap to make. And I also get the impression from the emphasis on unfabrication, that this leads you maybe in a similar place to me, which is a metaphysics that's very kind of agnostic or non-committal around what the true fundamental nature of reality is. I would be inclined to say it's a process, but the thing in itself can't be really pinned down with a concept. Is that how do you see idealism fitting with this?
Yeah, okay, good. So there's a few things. First of all, just to come back to the weed, I think that's a great example, by the way, of illustrating emptiness. And actually, it's also a great example of showing us that we mustn't be somehow reifying the noumenon, the thing in itself. And this was essentially a criticism of Kant that was leveled by Schopenhauer, who really respected Kant, but he said, look, one of the things that Kant was wrong about is that there is no such thing as the weed in itself, the real weed out there, that you described as some sort of quantum fuzz weed, but it's not. It's just, there's some reality out there. And in a sense, it's not helpful to think about that reality as objective reality, because what we consider to be objective reality, whatever it is somehow co-arising between the world in itself, or the reality as it is, and as we observe it and we create our own experience of it. And to some extent, maybe there are billions of experiences and therefore billions of worlds out there. But there is this sort of central world. So just this, just to kind of say that, look, this noumenal world is a lot more open about that. Now, the second point, which is, I think, very good that you made it, is that initially, when people take psychedelics or when people have the experience of non-dual awareness, there is this too easy leap to take, which is, hey man, that tree is made of consciousness. Well, yes, it is made of consciousness, because that tree is arising within my experience. And yes, it is also true to say that kind of I am everything within my experience. What I really am is the whole field of experience, and it's all made of consciousness. But so far, that hasn't told us anything about reality in itself, ultimate reality. We've somehow got information from the world, and it yet hasn't told us anything. So the too fast leap, we need to be careful of. Now, having said that, that kind of leaves us in this very agnostic position to say, yes, okay. And we also know that the world as it is in itself is very open. It's sort of, there kind of isn't an objective world in the way we normally think, composed of weeds and grass and human categories kind of thing. But we do think that there is an external world. And this was again, Kant understood this. If I place my phone down here, you'll find it in the same place. It's sort of reliable. The external world is reliable, and it's reliable, amazing to an amazing extent. Even though one can think of physics as just a map in our of mapping our phenomenal experience, yet we can measure the magnetic moment of an electron to 13 decimal places. Astonishing. I mean, Feynman thought this was just beyond belief. I mean, that is measuring the distance between New York and LA to the width of a human hair. And so we can have models of ultimate reality which seem to be very reliable. So now, what could be the nature of that ultimate reality? Well, let's just take this very slowly. In one sense, the great insight of Descartes wasn't actually that I think, therefore I am, and there's a thinker and there's a, it was simply that there is experience, there is something, there is experience. Even if it's illusory, I'm having, there's an experience of that illusion. So there is something. I mean, that's a very minimal thing. And the experience, of course, is just the way we humans are boiling down this sort of single nugget of there is something. Now, the one leap is that, okay, and this is in a sense what Schopenhauer did, and that many mystics have done. Not the too fast leap that the tree, but this is more a subtle leap towards, which is that, look, the only thing we really know about ourselves is that the kind of substrate, the ground of our being, is some sort of pure consciousness. Now, then there's a kind of a leap of faith to say, well, if that's my ground of being, then, and there is nothing to distinguish that ground of being from James's ground of being and any other being, okay, so maybe that's the same ground of being. And then there's a sort of leap to say, well, maybe that's what the kind of that's the one thing we know about reality, because after all, aren't we a part of reality? This was Schopenhauer's idea that, like, we're also a part of reality, and the kind of thing that the bedrock that we can find is this kind of ground of being, of pure awareness. And so maybe that is the ultimate reality. Now, that's one way. I would say that that's much less fast than the other route from non-duality, but I would say that there are other, that's a guess, and there are other guesses that one could have. I tend to take quite an agnostic view about this, trying to keep as open-minded a position as possible, because I think to some extent they're all kind of helpful stories. But another view is that reality is some sort, what we get from reality. One thing we know about reality is that we get information. It's some sort of process, some sort of informational flux or something like this, some sort of process, that dynamic process, quantum, unfolding of the wave equation or something like this. And that is this kind of process view of reality is what the ultimate nature of reality is. Another view is that it's more informational. Another view is that it's neither consciousness nor physical. It's some sort of neutral monism, that it is reality, and we humans can start to perceive awareness, or certainly awareness is concentrated in us by maybe our neural architecture, but that's just a single dimension of ultimate reality, and this is probably more like Spinoza's view. Yeah, I mean, the nature of ultimate reality we have to be very slow and careful about. And
right. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, with the Schopenhauer line of saying, the noumenon, the thing in itself, isn't entirely out of reach because we are an example of the thing in itself. I'm inclined to say that deeper than being awareness, I think I seem to be some kind of relational flux. I'm dependent on this kind of some interdependent process. Um, and my consciousness seems to be very much dependent on how I interact with my environment. So it seems to be an emergent property of that. So I'm happy to say that we can have insight into the foundational nature of reality as a kind of relational flux through our own experience of the world. And then that's actually borne out by our physical study of the world, as kind of what you were getting at earlier, I think, with saying that we shouldn't reify the objective world and say it really is a static thing out there. It really does depend on our interactions with it. So the main reason to get this straight, I don't know if we have got it straight or if it'll be more confused in people's minds now, but in the kind of mainstream scientific view, since Kant and with modern neuroscience, there's been this move away from the folk psychological notion that we just see the world as it is, and to an appreciation that there is conscious perception is a process of inference, of inferring what's out there. We never see it directly, but we're kind of conjuring it. So when we see the tree, we're not directly seeing the tree, but we're conjuring some kind of image of the tree. And just as a side note, I think because you might ask what the relationship is between that representation, that image, and the thing in itself. And I think it's useful for people to keep in mind that the mapping, as far as I can see, you never actually, we might talk about inferring the causes of your sensory impressions. What is it that's out there in the world that's giving rise to the sensory impressions? But actually, I think a subtle thing that's worth pointing out is that it's the structure of the world outside that you are coming to infer. You never actually, there is no essence of tree that you can infer the existence of. There is no kind of, you're never trying to directly apprehend the thing in itself. The outside world is structured in a certain way, it behaves in a certain way, and we come to our impressions of the world come to reflect that. So there's this, in order to successfully exist and navigate in the world, and this is where maybe people can get an impression of why this ties into thermodynamics and life, is in order to exist and keep yourself going, there's this imperative to successfully do this task of mapping out the structure of what's around you, because how else are you going to find food? How else are you going to avoid dangerous things, right? So on a common sense level, you can see, okay, if I'm going to keep myself together on an energetic thermodynamic level, I have to do inference. I have to map this structure of the world beyond. And so Hermann von Helmholtz is a big name, right? And kind of putting forward this idea of perception as inference. And then we get up to what we spoke about earlier, the kind of the Bayesian brain. The Bayes' theorem is the kind of optimal way to do this. So maybe you could give a bit of an overview of the Bayesian brain and why, what it is about Bayes' theorem that kind of gives us something useful when it comes to thinking about perception.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just maybe we'll put a pin in this, because I really like the talk that you mentioned about relational metaphysics, and I kind of wanted to introduce Carlo Rovelli's latest thinking around relational quantum mechanics.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, there are going to be so many different threads here. Feel free to run wherever.
Maybe let's just leave a pin in it. Just say relational quantum mechanics, and then Carlo Rovelli is a really serious physicist. Realized that his view of relational view of quantum mechanics turns out to be kind of very similar to Nagarjuna's view. So we'll come back to that. But to come to the Bayesian brain, Helmholtz has this idea that he takes Kant's ideas and really takes it further to say, look, essentially we are doing the brain has to be a statistical agent. We have to kind of infer what's going on. And Bayes' theorem, just to kind of, for people who want to, a review of it, is essentially just saying that, what we need to do, the fundamental perception problem is to figure out what's going on in our world. And we might have a certain hypothesis. Let's call it hypothesis A. And we need to, what the brain has to do is, what is the probability of hypothesis A given our sensory data? Okay, given the sensory data we see. And we basically want to choose a hypothesis which has a high probability of being borne out by the sensory data. So, we might have several hypotheses: hypothesis A, hypothesis B, hypothesis C. And so we want to choose the hypothesis that has the greatest probability of being correct given our sensory data. But that turns out to be very difficult. Well, if we only had 3 hypotheses, we could do it, but we have an infinite number of alternative hypotheses, so we can't solve that problem. So, but Bayes' theorem says that, look, the way you do this is, instead of asking the question, what's the probability of hypothesis A given my sensory data, we can say, well, that's going to be equal to the probability of seeing my sensory data, assuming that hypothesis A is correct, times the probability of hypothesis A being correct in general. So when I look at these pair of glasses, that kind of, well, maybe I'll choose the bottle. When I look at this bottle, and if anyone's just listening to this, I'm lifting up a bottle, and when I look at this, I say, well, what's the probability that these sensations, this visual data that I'm getting, what's the probability that this visual data is from a bottle times the prior probability that there are bottles around, which is pretty high, a prior probability. If it was the prior probability that, I don't know, this is a bomb, that would be less high. So and this is, and then there's a normalizing term that finishing it off. So this is how you go about being a scientist and a sort of statistician. The brain has to be a statistician, and that basic algorithm of trying to solve that equation, but not solving it directly, solving it, as we said, by doing a simulation of the world, is essentially, from a first principles position, is this idea of, roughly speaking, what's going on in the brain? What are all these neurons doing? What are they trying to do? And it's surprising. This idea has grown in the last couple of decades in neuroscience, and essentially it's turned neuroscience upside down. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I mean, if 20 years ago, most people's idea of what's going on in the brain was some sort of feed-forward information processing. So we get information from the world and we process it up and we refine it until we figure out, oh, look, there's an apple and there's a grandmother, and etc. And we now realize that that's not how the brain works at all. That would be far too difficult. It would be impossible to do that task. It turns out that what we are actually doing is, instead of feed forward, we're mostly doing feedback. We're kind of guessing and generating what we expect to be going on. And the data that we get is simply saying, look, there's a prediction error between what you think is going on and this piece of sensory data that we've got here. And so please adjust your parameters of your generative model, of your simulation model. And that turns out to be, why we got it upside down. So what's happening, instead of a feed forward network, we've actually got just feedback. And it turns out there's anatomical, well, there are 10 times as many feedback neurons than feed forward neurons. And that was always a mystery. But the idea is that this is compatible with this kind of predictive processing view of how the brain is working.
Right. And that pitch you just gave of, until very recently, the science of how the brain does perception, really was very influenced by the tools of engineering, because, lots of great tools of signal processing. And so there was this, as you say, feed forward kind of linear systems approach, where if you take hearing, it's like, all right, let's decompose the sound into all the frequencies, and then we'll basically say, okay, if these frequencies are together, you add them up, keep processing them, and eventually you get to a detector that turns on and says, okay, that's James's voice because it has all these features. But actually, that's not a particularly great way to solve the problem. And it also just happens to be, it seems that's not how embodied agents actually do solve these problems. And instead, there's this kind of inference that goes straight to the kind of making a guess about what's this thing that I'm perceiving, and then almost fills in the details afterwards. And so I think, just to give people a feel of the kind of elegance of kind of Bayes' insight, if you live in a dense forest, if you take a really simple agent that just has to detect kind of horizontal versus vertical lines, if you've lived in that forest your whole life and you've built up a model and expectations of the world, if you open your eyes, you're actually going to really expect to see a vertical line. And if you see a tree that's fallen at quite a sharp angle, you're probably still likely to categorize that as a tree, and kind of almost correct for it, because you're really expecting vertical lines. If it's horizontal, that might be enough counter evidence. That might be very unlikely to see a horizontal tree. So then actually Bayes kind of captures that you're not going to, you'll successfully not perceive as a tree in that instance. And there's a, Daniel Kahneman and Tversky had this experiment kind of showing non-optimal reasoning in humans, where they give an example of someone they describe as a kind of very meek and shy, tidy, orderly individual, and they ask people, is this person a librarian or a farmer? And almost everyone says a librarian, but actually there are tens and tens more times farmers than there are librarians. So what the Bayes insight is, you really need to factor that in. If there are 20 times more farmers than there are librarians, it's actually that really, it may be more likely there's a farmer just because of that sheer weight of numbers. So that's your kind of your prior expectation of it's being factored in. So Bayes allows us to kind of optimally weight all these different relevant things to come up with hypotheses, update them, and successfully come up with a hypothesis based on the evidence that we're getting, right? So we're generating models of the world. We're guessing what's going on out there based on the information that's coming in, and that's giving this controlled hallucination, right, of image of the world that's we use to navigate in the world. And then this is thought to be kind of hierarchical, right, in the brain.
Yeah. So the idea is that where do these priors come from? And this is interesting because it turns out that this kind of this generative model is built in layers. It's built in a kind of hierarchy. So for the low-level models, the priors are coming from another set of models a layer above. And the priors for those models are coming from another set, the layer above. And we don't know how many layers there are, but there might be, something like half a dozen layers or something like that. And this is a very efficient architecture in computer science and in general to see that more general priors about the world cascade down and influence more and more detailed sub-models of the world. And so these and the kind of top level models include that you're an agent, that there is somebody here at the center of, there is a self model, for example. There could be, another top level model might be some sort of general emotional disposition. For example, a prior that if you're a depressed person, the prior, one of the top level priors might be the world's a pretty difficult and nasty place, and I'm a useless person, and that's the sort of prior or the lens, the model that you use to influence the perception of all your data. And the funny thing is that when you look at the world through the lens of that depressed person that's saying the world's an awful place and I'm a useless person, it turns out that yes, the world seems to, you just focus on the negative and you see all this validation of this kind of negative viewpoint, and that prior is therefore reinstantiated. It's strengthened. And that's why you get stuck in a rut. So yeah, as you say, there's these hierarchies, and one of the things that seems to be particularly helpful in a therapeutic context and in the context of meditation, and actually in the context of explaining how psychedelics work, is that psychotherapy, meditation, and psychedelics tend to soften, quieten the influence of these top-level models, these top-level priors. And that allows us to see the world in a fresh way, in a way that we're not accustomed to normally seeing, in a more innocent, fresh, and closer to the world. So suddenly, someone who's depressed might have might take psychedelics and then see the world in a way that is, for the first time in ages, oh look, the world isn't a terrible place. It's kind of beautiful. It's amazing. They see it in a very fresh way, and that is a kind of cognitive dissonance to that prior. And so, as the drug wears off, perhaps the prior might be down-regulated, down-weighted, and maybe that's could be a reason why, for some period of time, for a month or 2 or 3, people tend to go into remission, tend to come out of depression.
Right. And so in that example, we were using earlier with if you're raised in the forest and you come to have a prior expectation that you're going to see trees around you, and then you actually move to a different environment, you're still going to have that model unless it's updated, and you might be seeing trees where there aren't any, which seems harmless. But if instead that's that you've been raised in a circumstance where there's a lot of interpersonal kind of lack of safety, then in your romantic relationships and your adult life, you may misinterpret looks as kind of, threatening. You may see interpersonal threats where there aren't any. And this is, I think, kind of quite a basic psychotherapeutic thing that can play out with people. And then with something like psychedelics, you're down-regulating those expectations, those priors, those models, and that's allowing you to actually update your beliefs in line with the evidence. You're seeing, well, actually, they're not giving me a threatening look. They're actually just looking in a normal way, and I was unnecessarily interpreting it that way. I was actually reading a recent paper that came out yesterday that I was going to send to you on showing that ketamine seems to, the antidepressant effects, they were arguing in this new research that is due to, in depressed people, you have, if you get them to estimate how likely is that something negative is going to happen to them, like being bitten by a dog, some random event, and then you give them the actual kind of chance of it happening and kind of on average in the population, they don't update they have kind of negativity bias. They don't update appropriately. But after ketamine, they do update. And so it seems to kind of correct that, the inability to update your models, which might, physiologically that might be due to changes in plasticity in the brain. But so it really fits with this idea that, this Bayesian idea of belief updating being really crucial. And I know you're acknowledged on the Rebus paper with Carl Friston and Robin Harris, which is very much to do with this idea. Maybe you could explain that, but I feel like maybe you've already explained the kind of core idea.
Yeah, I think we, that was this idea that I talked about in terms of reducing the precision weighting of top-level priors. But just coming to this point that you made about this general issue in psychopathology, I mean, this may be a way of thinking about what's happening in psychopathology in general, that essentially people get stuck in either depressed beliefs or delusional beliefs, schizophrenia, where the common theme seems to be some sort of very rigid, unhelpful top-level priors. So there seems to be two issues. Number one, the priors aren't, to some extent, we would say in normal speak, we would say, well, they've got delusionary beliefs that they're kind of, they're not veridical. They're stuck in a way of seeing the world, and they can't get out of it. So that their priors are rigid and they're wrong, in inverted commas. Okay, don't like to use the word wrong, but in the common view would be that, well, they're not the same as all the rest of us, and there seems to be two things in promoting health. One is moving to more helpful priors, more, perhaps a view of optimism or something like that. But I think also a view of flexibility. And I think you touched on this. So I think really health is not just about changing one's priors. It's about holding them lightly and having them able to adapt flexibly to new circumstances. And so sometimes priors can be, correct. I mean, we can change them from being delusory to being correct. And other times, it could be a matter of opinion, how we look at the world, glass half empty or glass half full. It's just that by looking at it glass half full, it leads to a more beautiful life. So let's do that.
Right. Yeah. And so in this picture where you have your prior expectations, your models of the world, and then you're combining that, right, with the evidence that's coming in. So what you end up perceiving is a kind of a weighted sum, right, of those two factors.
Right, exactly. So that comes back to something like Bayes' theorem. There were two terms in Bayes' theorem that we talked about. One was likelihood of the data. How likely is this data given my hypothesis of what's going on in the world? And then the second was the prior, which is what's the general, how likely is this hypothesis in the first place? And so the perception that we have is a weighted average of these two. And the weights, the weights that are used to put these two together are called precision weights. Now, what precision is for those who are sort of technical, precision is the inverse of variance. So, in other words, the more good evidence I have for my prior, in other words, the more strongly I believe my prior, the stronger it's going to count in this in the weighted average of my overall perception. The more I believe my sensory data, the stronger that's going to count. So, for example, let's say I'm looking down the road and it's a bit of a foggy day, and I see this kind of lion go down the road. I think it's a lion, but actually I'm not going to perceive it as a lion because it's a very foggy day. So the sensory data is down-regulated. It's got low precision. So it's not very good quality evidence. Whereas my prior of seeing a lion is super low. My prior of seeing a dog, on the other hand, is quite high. So when I actually perceive this animal, it's going to come out as a dog because the prior of seeing a dog is very high, and I'm going to downweight my sensory evidence. Now, on the other hand, let's say it's a bright, clear day, and I've got very good, like I can really see the down the road very sharply. And I see something that looks like a line. Now, even though my prior is quite low, my sensory evidence is really good. I have a really good look at it, and and I'm going to perceive it as a lion, and then I'm going to think, well, maybe it's escaped from the zoo. So that's this idea that perception is a kind of combination. We only see the end result. We don't see both. We see the this weighted average of our priors and our sensory data coming together.
Right. And then as we're kind of constructing our models of the world and we're learning to perceive the world and building a simulation of it, we're kind of you're factoring in the lessons like this, right? And you're updating your beliefs in line with errors in your predictions, right? You make a prediction, turns out that it's not right, and then you update. And the free energy principle kind of comes in as a kind of pragmatic way that an organism can achieve this, right? Given you were saying it's kind of computationally intractable to try and do all the necessary calculations for an organism to just do kind of raw Bayes inference. So I wonder if you could give a go at explaining why the free energy principle is kind of relevant here.
Yeah. I mean, so the free energy principle is nothing but this approximate Bayesian inference. Actually, it's really working out that Bayesian inference algorithm in information theory, and essentially you end up with two terms in the free energy. And those two terms is what we've already been intuitively talking about. So the free energy is a combination of these two terms. The first term is simply how good a fit is the sensory data that I'm getting to the model that I have of it. So how good a fit is the sensory data that I'm getting that this is a lion, okay? And if it's because no data is unambiguous. So if it's very, very good sensory data and it really fits the model of a lion very well, then it's not very surprising. In other words, the sensory data is not surprising given that it's a lion. So this is sort of the first term of the free energy principle, is that it's minimizing surprise of the sensory data given your assumptions about what's going on. So that's what we need to do, is basically have models of the world that are least surprising. And surprise is a kind of an information theoretic term and something that's very expected. In other words, this is exactly the kind of data that I would see if I was seeing a lion. This is the data that I'm seeing, that if the probability of seeing the data if it was lion is 1, that would be zero surprise. The probability of being a half would be kind of surprising, and the probability of seeing this data if it was a line being 0.0001 would be very, very surprising. So I would reject the model that it was a lion. So that's the first term. The second term is essentially how far away from how far away is this model of say it's a lion from my prior? Well, that's kind of far away. It's and we measure that technically using something called the Kullback-Leibler divergence. But all that really means is it's saying, how different is this a lion from my priors of seeing something down the road, which is probably a dog or a cat, and so the further it is away from your prior, the more penalized, the less likely you are to perceive it. So these are the two terms: how good a model is it fit, how we want a model that is minimizes surprise. So we want a good fit model. And on the other hand, we want a model that is as close as possible to our prize. And this balance of these two terms are the two components of the free energy. And why it's called free energy? Oh, well, that's a really weird thing, but it's basically called free energy because the mathematical equation turns out to be exactly the same mathematical equation as used to describe free energy in thermodynamics. And it's the same mathematical formula. Now, that's not a coincidence. But from our perspective, we can treat it like a coincidence. It's not a coincidence because essentially thermodynamics is a kind of branch of information theory. It's sort of how energy levels are distributed. And what we're talking about here is just pure information theory. And so, that's why it was called free energy, because it has the same form.
Because I think when the way that this is often formalized by Carl Friston is in terms of embodied agents, right? Because this leads to active inference, the idea that action could also be included in this picture. And so that's modeled with the organisms having a boundary that they have to maintain over time. So then you can tell a story starting with thermodynamic free energy coming from the sun and being fed into systems, on Earth, and then systems maintaining their order through this boundary maintenance, which then involves what's a reduction in variational free energy, which is what we're talking about, like informational free energy. So it gets kind of confusing because these are two different things, but they are mathematically related. But I think it's good for people to have that clear that those are two different things if they're following that whole story. So then we have this picture of the brain, and I mean, to me, that story, it's tempting to just always map this onto the brain, but it seems to me this does apply to all organisms. That all organisms have to be doing some kind of inference to exist. And in the past, you've been kind of sympathetic to my living mirrors perspective, and I feel like with the whole idea of our conscious experience of the world being itself a kind of something that arises through this relational dynamic of fabrication. Does that, if you're going to say that it's only something to do with brains, then you have to kind of add in an extra step and say, what is it that's different about brains that isn't there in other organisms? And then, we get into questions, as to whether we can even say that consciousness is a fabrication. And I feel like when you're getting down to that level, to say that only we have consciousness in brains would be to kind of really reify it and say that there's something extra going on. Is that roughly how you see it?
Well, yeah, exactly. So first of all, I would say, I think you're absolutely right that this is not just, special for brains. I think any organism that in Carl Friston's terminology has a kind of Markov blanket, and that means sort of a boundary, an informational boundary, and that is surviving. In other words, temporarily surviving. It's staving off the relentless second law of thermodynamics that things disintegrate. Must be using its information well. So any organism gets information, and as you say, what is the purpose of that information? Well, it's not just to figure out what's going on, but it's to figure out what's going on so that it can do actions to maintain itself from dying, to stop itself dying. In other words, get away from the fire, get away from being frozen, go towards the apple, get away from the tiger, or whatever it is. And so the overall schema is that, and this is why Bayes' theorem is so fundamental, Bayes' theorem simply gives us a recipe to use information optimally. So if you're not using information optimally, if you're wasting information, if you're leaving, food on the table, so to speak, informationally, then you're more likely to be eaten by the tiger, or swallowed up by the chemical gradient if you're a cell or something like that. So it's simply the idea that evolution must approximate Bayesian inference, because if they didn't, they would be leaving food on the table, information, it'd be wasting information. So it would be like a bacterium that can sense the acidity. Acid environments might degrade a bacteria, so it would kill a bacterium. So bacteria tend to swim away from acidic environments, and they tend to swim towards glucose-rich environments. In this kind of, they have a very primitive action. For example, turning a flagella, sort of little propeller, which allows them to approximately go towards a sugar gradient and approximately go away from a acidic gradient. Now, even such a simple system like that bacterium has to be using its information well. Let's suppose it kind of received some signals. It had sort of chemotaxis. It sort of has chemical receptors which measure acidity and glucose and even gradients across the length of the bacterium, and let's say it didn't kind of use those signals optimally, and so its actions were a bit random. Well, that type of bacterium would kind of be wouldn't do well in the evolutionary race against another species of bacteria which kind of used it more optimally. And since the mathematically optimal way of using information is Bayes' theorem, we can't ever get there, but that's the sort of upper limit. That's the correct thing to do. We're obviously going to find that throughout nature, organisms use information well. And using information well is essentially grounded in surviving. And this is that relationship, just to unpack a little bit of what you said, this is that relationship between using information well, going through variational Bayes, and minimizing variational free energy, which is using information well, and avoiding death, aka succumbing to the second law of thermodynamics, things going to disorder. So in order to avoid the second law kind of in its local environment, this is not breaking the second law, because the second law only applies to the universe as a whole, closed systems. This is simply allowing organisms to survive means using information well. And so that's that very deep connection, which is why we must find approximately that most organisms will be doing Bayesian inference, whether they have brains or not.
Right. And I think the impression that something like a single cell with a flagella just kind of swimming around in a chemical gradient, the impression that they're kind of a bag of reflexes and it's their task of survival is simple enough that they don't need to be doing the things you were just describing. To me, there's a kind of there's just a it's not true that they just live in this very simple kind of niche where there's an abundance of tasks. The environment's easy to navigate, and it would require a level of stability that doesn't exist in our reality. There's always uncertainty. Who's to say whether salt gradients are going to change and chemical gradients, all these different things may be correlated. And given what you were saying about the imperative to kind of behave in a kind of that selection will sculpt things to be informationally efficient, it totally makes sense. I think that even the simplest organisms are not simple. If you could zoom in on the cell and look at its process of replication, all the metabolism going on, none of these things are simple by any means. But so to bring back to the kind of Bayesian brain as we're thinking about in humans, kind of engaging in experiences that might lead to kind of awakening, you have this. We're talking about you generate a kind of representation of a tree, stuff in the outside world, but you also generate what you were calling the phenomenal self model, right? There's a, for my brain and my skull, there's information coming in and it's getting clues as to the existence of a body, but then it kind of has this model of a body, but it's all appearing in what we can call non-dual awareness, right? They're all equally appearing, but then there's this trick, this illusion that actually that stuff's out there, I'm in here, and now I'm an agent who's going to navigate the world. And so maybe we can tie this back into where we began with the jhanas and with kind of what happens when you reduce phenomenal content and deconstruct and get in touch with non-dual awareness.
Yeah. So that's, so the idea is that when we have this very special ability to kind of, to have awareness of awareness of, we can become aware of our phenomenal experience. And I think this allows us to realize that the very helpful model of having an agent self in a world, which is very important from an evolutionary perspective, because if we didn't have that, we would be eaten by the tiger. If we kind of just couldn't make sense of, I'm here, the tiger's over here, I need to move in that direction when the tiger moves there, etc. We couldn't survive. And yet it's a kind of an elaborate construction. And we can become aware of the whole holodeck, if you like that Star Trek metaphor. And that in that holodeck of experience is a little mini-me character, avatar. And most people think that their awareness is kind of somewhere behind the eyes of that little mini-me avatar. But in fact, they are the entire holodeck. And that one of the reasons why that can be very profound and why it is the bedrock of spiritual traditions is that when we awaken to that sense of non-dual awareness, that the normal sense of self and ego is a kind of a construction, several things happen. This is kind of a deep question. Well, why would that be useful to awaken to that? Now, it's a good question. And, most people will say, well, listen, that all sounds very weird, but like the Buddha talked about, stopping suffering. That's what I want. Okay, well, let's see if we can try to map out that journey between recognizing non-dual awareness and human flourishing. So when we suddenly when we become aware that the normal sense of what the ego wants, I don't want this and I want this and all of that are just constructions, they become less grippy. So it's this idea that if I'm having some pain or some emotion and I'm just like, that's me, that's who I am, it's like I'm just wrapped up in that. It's very reified, to use a philosophical jargon term. It's kind of really seems real and objectified. When we become aware that this is just arising, there's some emotion just arising, or there's some pain just arising, and I can be aware of that. And that, by the way, that's not me, because I am aware of that. So it becomes more empty, less reified, less grippy. It's actually sort of like smoke and mirrors, more ephemeral. And it tends to lose its grip. It's, when you go to a scary movie, how is it so scary? Because like there are some movement in the shadows, and you imagine, oh my God, there's a monster in the background. But actually, if you look at all the pixels, you realize, gosh, there's hardly anything there. Why am I scared of that? Right? And that's that sense of de-reifying something, and it just loses its grip. It loses its potency. And now we have room between stimulus and response, because the story of suffering is simply that we just move between stimulus and response, and we're stuck in our patterns. We can't see the bigger picture. And someone irritates me and I'm about to biff them in the face. Well, that's going to cause a lot of suffering all around. But if I suddenly get, look, there's some irritation arising, and I can see it, and I can just see, oh, look, I wonder why I'm getting irritated, and you have more room to kind of act wisely. And so there is this deep connection between our phenomenal experience and the character of it, and the reification of objects and phenomena, and most importantly, the self, our emotions, our thoughts, our body sensations, pain, and well-being. So, yeah, I mean, more could be said about that. But
right. I mean, so I'm thinking you mentioned earlier that these kind of three dimensions that you can kind of simplify meditative traditions into. So you've got the kind of focused attention where you're quieting the mind, and then you've got the deconstruction, defabricating, deconstructing. What is it easy to map onto these kinds of Bayesian models where you think's happening there, and when you're doing focused, if you're just focusing on the breath, kind of what's happening to the models, and if you're engaging in the jhanas?
Yeah, so I would say that to some extent, the whole meditation game and path is about being a master, becoming a master of our conscious experience and how it's formed, and how we can choose to relate to it differently, how we can relate to it differently. In other words, instead of just being a character in a movie, you can suddenly become, to some extent, the director in the movie, and also choose the camera angles and the lighting and the wide view, and seeing things from different perspectives, and change the music and all this kind of stuff. And like that, the meditative path initially is designed, with those three dimensions, which is like, first, when you got a big movie on, you're so captivated. If there's a kind of a cowboy movie on, and like you say, become aware of the screen, and you're the cowboy. You say, what screen? I can't, the screen behind you. Oh, you mean the mountains? No, behind the mountains. What do you mean? I don't get it. The sky? No, like behind the sky. Because you can't get it, because you're so stuck in the story, you're so stuck in the movie, it's all reified. Now, I would say the first thing about the shamatha variation is, okay, let's do this, Mr. Cowboy. You just focus on, at the sensations of the breath of the nose, and everything quietens down. And the illumination of the mountains goes down, and the activity, all the extras in the movies just quieten down, and the whole movie just starts to become very, very dim, apart from perhaps the nose of the cowboy. And so and then at that stage, because it's so quiet, there's not much going on, the cowboy can start to see, oh, look, well, first of all, my nose isn't really the nose. It's made of these RGB pixels. That's weird. I hadn't noticed my nose was made of red, green, blue pixels, all flitting on and off like this. Well, isn't this interesting? And then he starts to look around, and everything's very dim. And things are not moving fast, so his attention is not getting dragged around. And he starts to look at his horse, and he finds that this horse is made of these pixels and whatever. And it's all dynamic, it's all movement. And he thinks, well, these objects that I think are objects are kind of impermanent. They're just a process. They're just dynamic flow. Everything's just dynamic flow. And then he looks at himself and says, I can't find me, cowboy. I just see this dynamic flow of pattern, and there's no self. And nothing's mine. This hand isn't mine. It's just like arising and appearing. And so that's the second part of this kind of deconstruction part. So the first part was turning down the illumination. And the second part is just deconstruction. And then the third dimension is now finally the cowboy can see that there is this substrate of reality which holds all these, which is the bed, the ground in which all these pixels are flashing. And so this is an analogy. This is a story, right?
It's a great one. Right. And then I guess in the kind of early Buddhist text, you would have maximizing all these things where you've got minimal phenomenal content and it's all unfabricated, and there's just awareness, or even beyond that, just kind of void. That's the kind of pinnacle. But then I think you and I shared this view that beyond that, bringing these insights back into embodied experience of the world where there is full phenomenal content is an important, or maybe the kind of the final project. And I think that's something we both, Locke Kelly is someone who's great at kind of talking about this, bringing non-dual awareness into embodied situation as well. So is that something you kind of advocate, bring, it's a kind of synthesis of the absolute and the relative, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the thing. Yeah, absolutely great. Because, there are some traditions that tend to say that this world is kind of illusory, and what we really need to do is just hang out in that pure ground of being, that vast, pure awareness, emptied of consciousness, maybe sit in a Himalayan cave and just be one with the capital S self, this vast, illuminated, shimmering emptiness. But actually, that is really like, maybe just that was very, very skillful, for the fact that there's a reason why the Buddha kind of advocated, like, the real story is just this lack of suffering, how to go about your life and go about it and flourish as a human being. And for that, we come back into the world, but now we have a very, very subtly different relationship. So we're back in the world. actually we never left it, and we recognize that our world is this sort of construction reality, and we come back maintaining a sense of de-reification, the sense that this is kind of a mental construction. We come back also being very light on the fabrication. We can still work with concepts, but we are not just locked in a story and a concept, locked in samsara. We can see the world and also can see it in all its unfabricated levels. And one of the things that happens is that the world just shines more because we are not ignoring all the low-level perceptual, beautiful details. When we go past the flower, now we're aware of the textures and colors and details. We look at a tree and we just become aware of the intricacy of the bark and the shimmeringness of the leaves as they flutter in the autumn wind, and we come back with our sense of self a little bit empty, less reified. So yes, we can feel all the emotions that are arising, the thoughts that are arising. Everything is allowed to arise, but it's all a little lighter, less grippy, emptier. And it's a beautiful way to be, to come back. I mean, people can reconstruct their world in different ways, but one way is to sort of come back into form with this slightly different de-reified notion. And then it's almost like the cowboy comes back into the movie and recognizes, like Shakespeare, the world is a stage. And then he thinks, well, how can I be a beautiful cowboy story? Let's make this cool.
Right. Is that tie in with the kind of soul-making Dharma?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And there's a reason why religious traditions end up being sort of convergent on some ideas like compassion, like love, because this in a sense is a beautiful reaction when one is less, when the self model is a little emptier and lighter, you're less self-centered. And so you realize that I'm in this world, and yes, there is suffering in this world, and to some extent, because I'm sort of so lighter about myself, it's sort of natural for me to help somebody else, and one can reconstruct one's world in different ways. I think we can upload different systems of priors, different stories or different worldviews can be uploaded. And so we, in a sense, you kind of deconstruct, go into reprogramming mode, and then slowly over many years, you can reconstruct yourself, reload a different program. You could upload the program of being a compassionate Tibetan monk. You could upload the program of being a caring eco-warrior, who wants to help the world because they see, enormous wrong actions going on.
Right. With the kind of emphasis on the beautiful things like compassion that you were talking about, I feel like maybe to end on there's this subject that I don't think we're going to put to bed, but I think we're both kind of naturalists, and as it seems to me that naturalism is really an attempt to see how things hang together without any brute facts. Instead of saying I'm a self or I have free will, or to me those are kind of brute fact placeholders because you've not really understood how that fits in with everything else that's going on in reality. But when you really pay attention to what's going on and what it feels like to exist, the naturalistic impulse, you might conclude that it's really going to be void, emptiness, in a kind of, not in a positively valenced way, in a kind of nothingy way. But there's undoubtedly this, huge amounts of beauty and positivity and bliss to be found in just perceiving anything. And I think to a naturalist that could be quite surprising, and is perhaps what leads people into words like God for reality, or kind of a sense of spirituality being something separate to a kind of naturalistic description of the world. But at the same time, I think, we've spoken about this before, is in some moments I'm tempted to say that kind of non-dual awareness and its openness is the same thing as love. But in another moment, I'm tempted to say that the kind of the positive valence is a kind of subtle fabrication, and beyond that, it really is just kind of truly empty void. So where are you at with that today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I also can kind of tune into different aspects, as you said. Right now, I'm probably at the idea that, like, the subtlest fabrication for organisms like us humans, being social animals, is that love is kind of the first fabrication to kind of appear in this. There's a natural. It's like that's the default mode, in a sense, that if there's nothing to fear, and if there's no problem to solve, and if everything's good, then I think that two things seem to come up. One is beauty and one is love. Right now, I'm tuning in more to the beauty aspect personally, which is that phenomenal experience, when it's recognized at just its pure level, is incredibly beautiful. It's just a miracle. I suppose the attitude that I have is more like beauty or miracle, gift kind of things. And those are very religious sentiments, but I think that they naturally arise because, in a sense, the cowboy can just look around and say, wow, there is something rather than nothing, and look how miraculous it is, and sort of super beautiful, and everything is beautiful. In fact, even ostensibly ugly things can be seen in their raw phenomenology as kind of beautiful, as a kind of miracle, an effulgent, shimmering, vivid display, a piece of dog shit shimmering on the pavement.
Yeah, I think I get that with decomposition. If you to watch a time lapse of something decomposing, there's something, there's a very strong visceral repulsion that feels very innate, but at the same time, you're watching an amazing complex process, like watching kind of a fractal, cream going into coffee, fractal spirals, that kind of quality. And with beauty, I'm often tempted to think that you could maybe define it in terms of being the release from a false impression of reality being mundane. So maybe it's not that reality is intrinsically beautiful, but it's that this process of model building, becoming familiar, leads us to a sense of, like, okay, everything's fine. I can just get on with my day. If I if I saw the crinkles on my cornflakes as like the Alps, as this beautiful, majestic landscape, even if geometrically they might be similar, then I'm not going to eat them and get about my day, right? And I think in Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley made a similar point, staring at his trousers, like we wouldn't get anything done if everything didn't feel kind of boring and mundane and familiar. So I can imagine that the beauty almost being a release from that, in which case you'd expect it to be transient, which is somewhat true. There is disenchantment that comes with experience, but maybe it doesn't happen as quickly as you might think. There's something very potent about it. But also, I was saying earlier that the naturalistic impulse is that there are no brute facts, but actually you could argue the fact of being is a kind of brute fact. And, you once said this, we were talking about this and you said that it's on, like, for kind of the reality, like as the kind of way to capture this kind of like, wow, like it's, this is conversation around the kind of, should we use the word God for the kind of this non-conceptual, just kind of the givenness, the brute fact that we actually exist. And, I do think there's a narrative you can tell about how you can get something out of nothing. Give kind of like no thingness is not really a stable state. There can't really be, if there's no thing, then there's a kind of infinite boundlessness in which if there's any possibility of anything ever arising, it will inevitably arise. And so you can kind of try and naturalize being, I think. But at the end of the day, I think it's hard to, I either swim into models and then notice I'm far too in abstractions, and then I come into being, and then you're kind of not enough in the abstractions, and you're just kind of, you can't really get anywhere. You're just like, wow, we exist. So this is why I said I doubt we're going to put this to bed today. I feel like we both just kind of swim between these different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I've been recently describing that, this idea that there is something rather than nothing, and it's sort of related to this idea that there is experience, and the sort of sense we get in the deepest states of meditation, which is there is being. And I often think, we have one bit of information, but now I've been thinking maybe it's 0 bits of information, because one bit of information is that it could be 1 or 0, there is something. Right. And that's assuming that there is a state which is there is nothing. But actually, we don't know if that's possible. And so all we know is that there is something, and we don't even know that there's an alternate state that, which would give us 1 bit of information.
Right.
0 bits of information is that
we're just staring at a transistor that doesn't work. It's just not going to switch on and off.
So that's I guess a good place, but to some extent, you could, tuning into that 1 bit of information, you could say that that's the ultimate mystery, or that's the ultimate miracle, or that's the brute fact of being, as you put it.
Right.
Yeah.
I think often people who mistake the map for the territory with science and believe that the project of science is to kind of disenchant the world, that those people, typically the people who see consciousness as an intractable mystery, as kind of like a miracle, because it's actual and they're experiencing it, and you can't convince them. It's not possible to convince that your pain isn't really there. It's an abstraction, But I think when that worldview, because there's a lack of this engagement with the mystery of being and that felt sense of awe, there's a kind of displacement onto consciousness, and it's you're not recognizing that actually that permeates everything. Your experience of everything is permeated with this sense of mystery, just because of the non-conceptual nature of reality, that it can't be put in your boxes. This has been a lot of fun as always, Shamil. I'll put the link in the description to the talk you gave at Oxford recently. And do you have a paper coming out soon on the kind of free energy landscape, psychobiology stuff?
Yeah, maybe in a while, and I'll send you when that's up.
Yeah, great. Do you have anywhere online that you send people to?
I don't. I have the beginnings of a YouTube channel, but which has got some technical talks, which you can find under my name, but that's it.
Great. Well, it'll be in the description. And thanks again.
All right. Brilliant. It's been fantastic fun.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.